Hello and welcome to WAVE's webinar session. My name is Barbara Stelnischek and I am a project coordinator at the WAVE office in Vienna. And today facilitating the webinar with me are Kelly Blank and Anka Chupa, who are both project coordinators at WAVE. This is the third and last webinar for the year 2016. And we are making it an office affair, so we are doing it together. We would like to thank you for taking the time and joining us today, and we hope that the session can be mutually beneficial and can support your work through knowledge sharing and reflection. As you can see from your screen, the session is titled Unique Selling Points of Women's NGOs, meaning that we will discuss different reasoning and evidence to help us in promoting the work of women's NGOs to ensure longevity and sustainability in the future. We're planning to run the session from 10 until 11:30 Central European time. And of course, depending on the time we spend answering any questions or having discussion and having audience input, we may end sooner than 11:30. And I would like to go through the webinar agenda to show you how we will divide the session and how we will divide the time of our session. In a short while, I will do a small briefing about the webinar, mainly discussing the technical aspects for participants and general information about the goal and the purpose, as well as the method of this webinar. And then I will go through some housekeeping rules about how to take part in the webinar so that we can stay organized and that we can get the most out of it. Then Kelly, Anka, and I will introduce ourselves to you, and following this for about 30 minutes, we would like to introduce the topic of today's webinar session, mainly the benefits and positive aspects of the work of women's NGOs. And we would like to divide the topic of unique selling points into 4 areas. And these are the Istanbul Convention's supporting articles for women's NGOs, the history of women's NGOs, political engagement, effectiveness of service provision, networking and multi-agency, and the 4th part, women's NGOs work in the area of prevention and awareness raising. Looking at the screen now, we have some information about the technical aspects of the webinar. As you may be aware, as a participant joining the webinar, you are automatically muted, and we will keep the muting on until the end of the presentation and beginning of questions and comments part of the webinar. And also, just as a note, Kelly, Anka, and I, we cannot see you, even if you have your webcam on. And in case something does not work, I would recommend that you close out the webinar and then log in again by clicking the link in your registration confirmation email. And also for your information, the webinar is being recorded. So a little bit of information about the webinar. It is what we would call a facilitated discussion. So at the beginning, Kelly, Anka, and I will present the topic, and then we will try to facilitate input from the participant. It is an activity within the WAVE Step Up campaign, which, as you know, runs from 2016 through 2017. And we are currently working on a European Handbook of Standards for Women's Support Services. So the goal of this webinar is to discuss benefits and positive aspects of women's NGOs and to answer any questions from the participants, to hear your opinions, comments, suggestions, and any contributions. And the results of this would be fed into the Handbook of Standards of Women's Services, which would be published at the beginning of 2017. And as this webinar is part of the Step Up campaign, I would like to call your attention to the WAVE Step Up campaign website. There is a screenshot of it now on your screen, and you can access the website by going to www.wave-stepup.org. And Kelly is in charge of keeping up the website, the Step Up website, so I will just allow her to give a little bit of information about it.
So on the screen, there's screenshots of a part of the website, and that's the home section, and you can see that's all of the European countries, WAVE members. About 30 countries of our WAVE members are involved in the campaign. So if you click on each country profile, you can see all of the activities that have been happening in the country, and it's updated regularly. A new feature to the website is the launch of our partnership with PCOM, and we are focusing on providing services for undocumented migrant women. So I encourage you to go to that part of the website, read about it, and sign the pledge.
Thank you, Kelly. So the very last slide, I think that's informational slide about the webinar. So how to take part in the webinar. It's relatively simple and hopefully enjoyable, and I'm sure you have also taken part in previous webinars before or other webinars as well. So of course have a listen to the presentation of the topics to prepare for the subsequent discussion, and during presentation of the topics, if you have any questions, please write the questions to the facilitators in the questions pane. You should have that available on your screen, and we will answer any questions that are written down when we start the discussion at the end. And then later on, once we answer those questions, if we have any written down, then we will go to the actual discussion where we will unmute the participants, and then during that time, if you have any comments or you would like to say anything, you just have to raise your electronic hand, and then we will invite you to speak and to give your contribution to the discussion. And of course, we hope that you enjoy it. So we will now get started by introducing ourselves. And the first person that you see on the screen is Kelly. So Kelly, tell us a bit about yourself.
Very briefly, my name is Kelly, and I have been working here in the office for over 2 years, and I am project coordinator. I'm mainly responsible for the WAVE advisory board members and for doing research and data collection for reports, and also for helping out with the Step Up campaign.
Thank you. Anka.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Anka. I have been working at WAVE since September 2015, and I'm responsible for organizing events, membership requests, contributing to different research reports, and because I have a legal background, for the legal issues at WAVE.
Okay, and I'm Barbara, and I work as a project coordinator, and I'm responsible for research, administrative data collection, and other activities. And also now I'm organizing webinar sessions, which are part of WAVE's technological outreach. So now we will start the topic. Anka will tell you about the Istanbul Convention, supporting articles for women's NGOs. Then I'll go a little bit into history of women's NGOs, political engagement, and contribution to social change, as well as the effectiveness of service provision, networking, and multi-agency cooperation. And then Kelly will finish the topic by discussing women's NGOs work in the area of prevention and awareness raising. So I hand it off to Anka.
Okay, so firstly, it is important to note that the Istanbul Convention provides direct and indirect tools for women NGOs to argue in favor of their existence. When I say direct tools, I'm talking about articles that refer directly to women NGOs. This would be the case of Article 8 and 9 of the Istanbul Convention, which refer directly to state support of women's NGOs and call for ratifying states to allocate appropriate financial and human resources for activities in the frame of implementing the Convention, including those carried out by non-governmental organizations. Article 9 specifically calls on ratifying states to recognize, encourage, and support at all levels the work of relevant non-governmental organizations and civil society active in combating violence against women and establish effective cooperation with these organizations. As for the other articles that you have on the slide, they talk about women NGOs indirectly. So for example, Article 4 is a key article in my opinion, as it forbids states to utilize discrimination on any grounds in implementing this convention, including migrant status, but other as well, such as sexual orientation, age, state of health, disability, marital status, and many more. I believe that undocumented migrant women, for example, or women from socially disadvantaged backgrounds are more likely to turn to non-governmental organizations for support rather than to state institutions because of the power associated with state institutions, especially those in charge of child welfare or financial aid. Another article that argues in favor of women NGOs is Article 11, which talks about data collection and research. But basically, Article 11 obligates states to collect disaggregated relevant statistical data at regular intervals, with the explanatory report for the states that such data is needed for appropriate policy making and mentions that the usefulness of service-based data. Women NGOs who run services for women need to be allocated appropriate financial support in order to be able to manage their data collection systems. Another important article it talks about awareness raising, and it's Article 13, which calls basically on states to implement regular awareness raising campaigns and programs, also in cooperation with civil society and non-governmental organizations. The explanatory report further states that many NGOs have a long tradition of carrying out successful awareness raising activities, so they would be the ones who are most entitled to do this. Lastly, I would also like to mention that the articles under Chapter 4, Protection and Support, referring to specialist services provision, have references made to women's organizations as best suited to provide specialist and community-based organizations for further services, or make references to women's shelters as playing a central role in networking, multi-agency cooperation, and awareness raising. To conclude, not only do articles of the Istanbul Convention incorporate the work of women's NGOs in its implementation, women's NGOs in Europe have a long history of political engagement and contribution to social change, conduct service provision effectively, network with each other and other organizations, improve multi-agency cooperation, and conduct a lot of work in the area of prevention and provision of expertise. I would like now to give the floor to Barbara, as she will be talking about history of women's NGOs.
Thank you very much, Anka, and thank you so much for going through the different articles of the Istanbul Convention. And I think it's important to point out that, you know, even though there are only 2 articles that directly point to support for women's NGOs, the actual existence of women's NGOs and the need to sustain women's NGOs is really enshrined throughout the entire Istanbul Convention. So I think that's very important to mention, so thank you very much for that. I will sort of go on to the next topic, which is the history of women's NGOs' political engagement and contribution to social change. So in a way, it's a bit of a celebration of the work that has been done by women's NGOs. And to prepare this, this particular slide that you see on your screen, we had a look through the WAVE's photo archive, and it was, since we're talking about history, it was really nice that we were able to find something from several years ago. And so you have that on your screen for you to see. So the first thing I would like to say about the history of women's NGOs is that there has been research to prove this evidence. There's evidence that women's NGOs change policy. There is a research from 2012 titled Civic Origins of Progressive Policy Change, Combating Violence Against Women in Global Perspective. And the research looked at about 40 years of government policy on violence against women in 70 countries around the world, and found that it was really the presence of strong feminist movement that had the greatest impact on positive policy change. So even certain governmental bodies did not have as much of an impact as women's organizations. And the research identified 3 main reasons why autonomous feminist organizations, so most likely small NGOs, are most effective. And first one is that they generate social knowledge about the topic of violence against women, and they develop a set of priorities that reflect the concerns of women. So this is something that is also, it's argued that general human rights NGOs would not likely set priorities that are of concern to women only. And they also provide a space in which women do not have to be silent. So for women, as any historically or socially disadvantaged group, having this kind of specialized representation is very important. And that's definitely an argument for the sustainability of women's NGOs. Another point that is also important to mention is that the existence of NGOs actually, especially those that work from the gender perspective, it supports international obligations. So not only do women's NGOs generate social change, but they do support the implementation of international treaties such as the Istanbul Convention or the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, where violence against women is defined as gender-based and a form of discrimination. So those international obligations start on the premise that violence against women is not individual, it's not family violence, it is violence directed against a woman because she is a woman. Hence, it requires that work in the area of combating violence against women is done from the gender perspective. And this is something that women's NGOs can do. Women's NGOs also shape and change the social conscience. I think historically, we can see currently that violence against women, even though it can be argued that there is still lacking political will to really combat violence against women, it is on the European agenda. Historically speaking, it is really women's NGOs that have fought to bring it on the agenda. And one of the ways is that women's NGOs actually defined violence against women. The definition, the gender definition, dates back to the 1970s, where the movement basically brought it to the public sphere to redefine violence, because it was usually seen as something that mostly is experienced by men, whether in war or in the public space. However, it was important to point out that violence against women is committed by the woman's current or ex-partner, and it's mostly in the private sphere. And this is the perspective from which we work today, and this is because of the historical involvement of women's NGOs. And then lastly, a point that is important to mention is that cost studies that are conducted more and more frequently, we can see definitely from conferences that we go to and from information that we receive that more and more countries are conducting cost of violence studies. And these show the incredible cost of violence for society. And this further proves the necessity of women's NGOs, especially if we compare the non-substantial amounts that it costs to actually sustain women's NGOs in comparison to the cost of violence to society. So this is the part about history. Now I would just like to quickly talk about the topic of effectiveness of service provision, networking and multi-agency. We can see also from the historical perspective that women's NGOs have led the movement against violence against women and have managed to establish a vast number of specialist services to support women survivors of violence. And the services, of course, provided a space for women to meet and to talk about their experiences, which, as I mentioned before, resulted in uncovering the fact that majority of violence against women is experienced in the domestic sphere. So such results do show us that there is still need for women-only spaces to exist as a means of raising and discovering issues that are important to half of the world's population. And also the fact that these services continue to exist today shows that they are effective in providing services for women who have experienced gender-based violence. Another thing that is important to mention is that women's NGOs that provide services continue to reinvent themselves and further specialize. As certain issues come to the forefront, whether it's crisis, refugee crisis, women's NGOs find different ways of operating and supporting women and further specializing their services, whether it's for women from minority ethnic backgrounds or women with disabilities or women living in rural areas, which shows in general that women's NGOs are very durable, they are needed, effective, and they're innovative and inventive. It is also important to mention that specialist services are actually the rights, it's a human right for women, partly because they prevent secondary victimization. As violence against women, of course, to combat violence against women, it involves various sectors in society. So women do have contact with state institutions, which it can be argued that they do lack sometimes appropriate training and sensitization, and women's NGOs play a role as intermediaries between survivors and other agencies. So this also goes back to women's NGOs supporting the implementation of international obligations. In this case, if we're talking about women having to deal with police or courts, preventing secondary victimization is also supporting the implementation of the due diligence principle. Another point is that women's NGOs work from the perspective of empowerment. So they ensure that survivors' needs are at the center of providing support and that women's own resources are utilized as means of building a path towards a violence-free life. And this is thought to be the most effective way and the most, it's change that lasts in a way, it can be said. And although it might be strange to say, utilizing women's own resources is not only highly effective, but it's also inexpensive. The last points that I would like to mention is that organizing into networks is very important, and this is something that women's NGOs do quite effectively. From our own research, we can see that there are over 100 women's networks in Europe, and this also supports state in various ways because it streamlines the work of services through common standards, as well as exchange of knowledge and information among networks, but also supports the collection of national level data on services or on service users, which supports the development of effective policy for the future. And lastly, what should be mentioned is that there is definitely a movement to implement effective multi-agency cooperation. And WAVE has created a manual called Bridging Gaps. It's a manual for setting up multi-agency cooperation in countries. And one of the things that is stated in the manual is that it is, of course, multi-agency cooperation is necessary to combat gender-based violence, but it does entail the existence of a strong network of women's support services. It is actually the most important prerequisite for multi-agency cooperation, because women's NGOs are needed as part of a broader referral network that is set up in a cooperative fashion and that involves supporting survivors by offering help from both specialist and general services. So that's my part about the effectiveness of women's NGOs. And now I would just like to hand it over to Kelly, which would be the last topic, and that's on women's NGOs' work in the area of prevention and awareness raising.
So as Barbara and Anka have made clear, women's NGOs have been active in the area of prevention, and their activities have contributed to significant progress over the last 4 decades. In 2015, WAVE conducted research for the WAVE report that included a variety of topics, including information on availability of women's specialist services, such as helplines, shelters, and centers. We also collected information on national networks of women's NGOs, emergency barring orders, and government policy and funding. However, we also wanted to further recognize the work that women's NGOs do outside of service provision, and therefore, we collected information on NGOs' work in the area of prevention and awareness raising. For this reason, we included sections on trainings and prevention work conducted by women's NGOs. The information was included in the form of good practice examples, giving short descriptions of different activities conducted in the format that you can see on your screen, and that's from our WAVE Report 2015. You can download the WAVE Report on our website. Public education and evidence-based policy and legislation are necessary to combat any gender-based violence. Women's NGOs not only conduct a significant portion of awareness-raising activities, they also provide expertise in the form of trainings of professionals working with women survivors of violence. With more ratifications of the Istanbul Convention and the monitoring started by a Gravio committee, as well as expected to focus in the future of prevention, WAVE feels that it's important to point to the important work done by women's NGOs, including those providing the services, in the area of training and other awareness-raising activities. This is especially important in light of Article 13 of the Istanbul Convention, calling on states to support awareness-raising activities and informing that NGOs have a long history of conducting such activities.
Yeah, all finished. Thanks, Kelly. So thank you very much for that information. I think that's also an important point, and this is something that Istanbul Convention talks about as well, is that that much of prevention and awareness raising has been done by women's NGOs, and that in addition to service provision, majority of such activities at the national level are actually done by women's NGOs. So this is something that has to be promoted and something that has to be continuously pointed out, because it is very important work. So now we're going to move to the discussion part. I'm gonna have a look at if there are any questions here. Okay. Well, let's have a look. I don't see any questions that are written down in the little questions pane that we have. So if anybody would like to either make a comment or would have a question about anything, you're very welcome to introduce yourself or your organization, tell us which country you're from. If you don't have any questions, we would also welcome a comment. So for example, we'd be happy to hear about any challenges that you face in relation to achieving positive recognition of women's NGOs in your country, or what opportunities do you see in achieving positive recognition of women's NGOs in your country, or if you actually have some practical information that you would like to share with us about how maybe you have done something to overcome any of such challenges towards recognition. We would just give a few minutes to maybe think of a question, and if we do not have any input, then we would thank you very much for attending, and then that would be it for the webinar session. Okay. It looks to me like there was a question actually from a participant that is asking about what the situation in Spain is regarding the implementation of the Istanbul Convention. If there is anyone from Spain and would like to comment, we would welcome a comment. But okay. All right. So I think this we will end, as I don't see that there are any questions from the audience. I would like to thank you very much for taking the time to join us, and we will also provide the recording. We will send it out, or information about the recording, via email, in case you would like to pass it on to other people. And we hope that this was helpful for your work, and we wish you a wonderful day, and we will now sign off.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.